He was out of breath. His little, narrow chest panted like a forge bellows. His eyes were full of the ignoble happiness of a feeble, cruel, and cowardly creature, which finds that it can, at last, harass what it has feared, and insult what it has flattered. The joy of a dwarf who should be able to set his heel on the head of Goliath. The joy of a jackal which is beginning to rend a sick bull, so nearly dead that he can no longer defend himself, but sufficiently alive to suffer still. LeBlanc did not interrupt him, but said to him when he paused, "I do not know what you mean to say. You are mistaken in me. I am a very poor man, and anything but a millionaire. I do not know you. You are mistaking me for some other person." "Ah!" roared Thénardier hoarsely, "a pretty lie. You stick to that pleasantry, do you? You're floundering, my old buck. Ah! You don't remember? You don't see who I am?" "Excuse me, sir," said LeBlanc with a politeness of accent, which at that moment seemed peculiarly strange and powerful, "I see that you are a villain. Who has not remarked the fact that odious creatures possess a susceptibility of their own, that monsters are ticklish?" At this word villain, the female Thénardier sprang from the bed. Thénardier grasped his chair as though he were about to crush it in his hands. "Don't you stir," he shouted to his wife. And, turning to LeBlanc, "Villain. Yes, I know that you call us that, you rich gentlemen. Stop. It's true that I became bankrupt, that I am in hiding, that I have no bread, that I have not a single sou, that I am a villain. It's 3 days since I have had anything to eat, so I'm a villain. Ah! You folks warm your feet. You have Sikowski boots. You have wadded greatcoats, like archbishops. You lodge on the first floor in houses that have porters. You eat truffles. You eat asparagus at 40 francs the bunch in the month of January. And green peas, you gorge yourselves, and when you want to know whether it is cold, you look in the papers to see what the engineer Chevalier's thermometer says about it. It is we who are thermometers. We don't need to go out and look on the quay at the corner of the Tour de l'Horloge, to find out the number of degrees of cold. We feel our blood congealing in our veins, and the ice forming round our hearts, and we say, 'There is no God.' And you come to our caverns, yes our caverns, for the purpose of calling us villains. But we'll devour you. Poor little things. Just see here, Mr. Millionaire. I have been a solid man, I have held a license, I have been an elector, I am a bourgeois, that I am. And it's quite possible that you are not. Here Thénardier took a step towards the men who stood near the door, and added with a shudder, "When I think that he has dared to come here and talk to me like a cobbler." Then addressing LeBlanc with a fresh outburst of frenzy. "And listen to this also, Mr. Philanthropist. I'm not a suspicious character, not a bit of it. I'm not a man whose name nobody knows, and who comes and abducts children from houses. I'm an old French soldier, I ought to have been decorated. I was at Waterloo, so I was. And in the battle I saved a general called the Comte of I don't know what. He told me his name, but his beastly voice was so weak that I didn't hear. All I caught was merci. Thanks. I'd rather have had his name than his thanks. That would have helped me to find him again. The picture that you see here, and which was painted by David at Bruxelles, do you know what it represents? It represents me. David wished to immortalize that feat of prowess. I have that general on my back, and I am carrying him through the grape shot. There's the history of it. That general never did a single thing for me. He was no better than the rest. But nonetheless, I saved his life at the risk of my own, and I have the certificate of the fact in my pocket. I am a soldier of Waterloo, by all the Furies. And now that I have had the goodness to tell you all this, let's have an end of it. I want money, I want a deal of money, I must have an enormous lot of money, or I'll exterminate you, by the thunder of the good God. Marius had regained some measure of control over his anguish, and was listening. The last possibility of doubt had just vanished. It certainly was the thénardier of the will. Marius shuddered at that reproach of ingratitude directed against his father, and which he was on the point of so fatally justifying. His perplexity was redoubled. Moreover, there was in all these words of thénardier, in his accent, in his gesture, in his glance which darted flames at every word, there was, in this explosion of an evil nature disclosing everything, in that mixture of braggadocio and abjectness, of pride and pettiness, of rage and folly, in that chaos of real griefs and false sentiments, in that immodesty of a malicious man tasting the voluptuous delights of violence, in that shameless nudity of a repulsive soul, in that conflagration of all sufferings combined with all hatreds, something which was as hideous as evil, and as heart-rending as the truth. The picture of the master, the painting by David which he had proposed that M. Leblanc should purchase, was nothing else, as the reader has divined, than the sign of his tavern painted, as it will be remembered, by himself, the only relic which he had preserved from his shipwreck at Montfermeil. As he had ceased to intercept Marius' visual ray, Marius could examine this thing, and in the daub, he actually did recognize a battle, a background of smoke, and a man carrying another man. It was the group composed of Pontmercy and thénardier. The sergeant the rescuer, the colonel rescued. Marius was like a drunken man. This picture restored his father to life in some sort. It was no longer the signboard of the wine shop at Montfermeil, it was a resurrection. A tomb had yawned, a phantom had risen there. Marius heard his heart beating in his temples. He had the cannon of Waterloo in his ears, his bleeding father, vaguely depicted on that sinister panel terrified him, and it seemed to him that the misshapen spectre was gazing intently at him. When thénardier had recovered his breath, he turned his bloodshot eyes on M. Leblanc, and said to him in a low, curt voice, "What have you to say before we put the handcuffs on you?" M. Leblanc held his peace. In the midst of this silence, a cracked voice launched this lugubrious sarcasm from the corridor. "If there's any wood to be split, I'm there." It was the man with the axe, who was growing merry. At the same moment, an enormous, bristling, and clayey face made its appearance at the door, with a hideous laugh which exhibited not teeth, but fangs. It was the face of the man with the butcher's axe. "Why have you taken off your mask?" cried thénardier in a rage. "For fun," retorted the man. For the last few minutes M. Leblanc had appeared to be watching and following all the movements of thénardier, who, blinded and dazzled by his own rage, was stalking to and fro in the den with full confidence that the door was guarded, and of holding an unarmed man fast, he being armed himself, of being 9 against 1, supposing that the female thénardier counted for but one man. During his address to the man with the poleaxe, he had turned his back to M. Leblanc. M. Leblanc seized this moment, overturned the chair with his foot and the table with his fist, and with one bound, with prodigious agility, before thénardier had time to turn round, he had reached the window. To open it, to scale the frame, to bestride it, was the work of a second only. He was half out when 6 robust fists seized him and dragged him back energetically into the hovel. These were the 3 chimney builders, who had flung themselves upon him. At the same time the thénardier woman had wound her hands in his hair. At the trampling which ensued, the other ruffians rushed up from the corridor. The old man on the bed, who seemed under the influence of wine, descended from the pallet and came reeling up, with a stone-breaker's hammer in his hand. One of the chimney builders, whose smirched face was lighted up by the candle, and in whom Marius recognized, in spite of his daubing, Pancho, alias Printanier, alias Big Renale, lifted above M. Leblanc's had a sort of bludgeon made of 2 balls of lead, at the 2 ends of a bar of iron. Marius could not resist this sight. My father, he thought, forgive me. And his finger sought the trigger of his pistol. The shot was on the point of being discharged when Thénardier's voice shouted, "Don't harm him." This desperate attempt of the victim, far from exasperating Thénardier, had calmed him. There existed in him 2 men, the ferocious man and the adroit man. Up to that moment, in the excess of his triumph in the presence of the prey which had been brought down, and which did not stir, the ferocious man had prevailed. When the victim struggled and tried to resist, the adroit man reappeared and took the upper hand. "Don't hurt him," he repeated. And without suspecting it, his first success was to arrest the pistol in the act of being discharged, and to paralyze Marius, in whose opinion the urgency of the case disappeared, and who, in the face of this new phase, saw no inconvenience in waiting a while longer. Who knows whether some chance would not arise which would deliver him from the horrible alternative of allowing Ursul's father to perish, or of destroying the colonel's savior? A Herculean struggle had begun. With 1 blow full in the chest, Leblanc had sent the old man tumbling, rolling in the middle of the room, then with 2 backward sweeps of his hand he had overthrown 2 more assailants, and he held one under each of his knees. The wretches were rattling in the throat beneath this pressure as under a granite millstone. But the other 4 had seized the formidable old man by both arms and the back of his neck, and were holding him doubled up over the 2 chimney builders on the floor. Thus, the master of some and mastered by the rest, crushing those beneath him and stifling under those on top of him, endeavoring in vain to shake off all the efforts which were heaped upon him, Leblanc disappeared under the horrible group of ruffians like the wild boar beneath a howling pile of dogs and hounds. They succeeded in overthrowing him upon the bed nearest the window, and there they held him in awe. The Thénardier woman had not released her clutch on his hair. "Don't you mix yourself up in this affair," said Thénardier. "You'll tear your shawl." The Thénardier obeyed, as the female wolf obeys the male wolf, with a growl. "Now," said Thénardier, "search him, you other fellows." Leblanc seemed to have renounced the idea of resistance. They searched him. He had nothing on his person except a leather purse containing 6 francs, and his handkerchief. Thénardier put the handkerchief into his own pocket. "What? No pocketbook?" he demanded. "No, nor watch," replied one of the chimney builders. "Never mind," murmured the masked man who carried the big key, in the voice of a ventriloquist, "he's a tough old fellow." Thénardier went to the corner near the door, picked up a bundle of ropes and threw them at the men. "Tie him to the leg of the bed," said he. And, catching sight of the old man who had been stretched across the room by the blow from Leblanc's fist, and who made no movement, he added, "Is Boulatruelle dead?" "No," replied Big Renail, "he's drunk." "Sweep him into a corner," said Thénardier. 2 of the chimney builders pushed the drunken man into the corner near the heap of old iron with their feet. "Babet," said Thénardier in a low tone to the man with the cudgel, "why did you bring so many?" "They were not needed." "What can you do?" replied the man with the cudgel, "they all wanted to be in it. This is a bad season. There's no business going on." The pallet on which Leblanc had been thrown was a sort of hospital bed, elevated on 4 coarse wooden legs, roughly hewn. Leblanc let them take their own course. The ruffians bound him securely, in an upright attitude, with his feet on the ground at the head of the bed, the end which was most remote from the window, and nearest to the fireplace. When the last knot had been tied, Thénardier took a chair and seated himself almost facing Leblanc. Thénardier no longer looked like himself. In the course of a few moments his face had passed from unbridled violence to tranquil and cunning sweetness. Marius found it difficult to recognize in that polished smile of a man in official life the almost bestial mouth which had been foaming but a moment before. He gazed with amazement on that fantastic and alarming metamorphosis, and he felt as a man might feel who should behold a tiger converted into a lawyer. "Monsieur," said Thénardier, and dismissing with a gesture the ruffians who still kept their hands on M. Leblanc. "Stand off a little, and let me have a talk with the gentleman." All retired towards the door. He went on. "Monsieur, you did wrong to try to jump out of the window. You might have broken your leg. Now, if you will permit me, we will converse quietly. In the first place, I must communicate to you an observation which I have made, which is, that you have not uttered the faintest cry." Thénardier was right, this detail was correct, although it had escaped Marius in his agitation. M. Leblanc had barely pronounced a few words, without raising his voice, and even during his struggle with the 6 ruffians near the window he